Valeria Sinclair's heart was beating so fast, she thought it might burst right through her wedding dress. She stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite of St. Patrick's Cathedral, staring at her reflection. The dress cost more than most people's cars. Her father had made sure of that. Everything about this wedding was expensive and perfect, just like her whole life had been. But she felt like she was suffocating. 10 minutes until we start, dear, her mother said, poking her head through the door. Your father is ready to walk you down the aisle. Valeria nodded, unable to speak. Her mother disappeared again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The thought of marrying Charles Henderson, a 60-year-old business partner of her father's, made her stomach turn. She knew exactly why this marriage was happening, to merge the Sinclair and Henderson empires. She was just another business deal. She looked at the window. They were on the second floor, but there was a decorative ledge that ran around the building. If she was careful. Before she could talk herself out of it, Valeria opened the window. The spring air hit her face, and she took her first real breath in what felt like hours. Without thinking too much about it, she stepped onto the ledge, holding tight to the window frame. Her expensive wedding heels made it impossible to balance, so she kicked them off, watching them fall to the bushes below. This is crazy, she whispered to herself, but kept moving. The ledge led to a drain pipe, and even in her giant wedding dress, she managed to climb down. Years of secret gymnastics lessons as a teenager finally came in handy. The moment her bare feet touched the ground, she ran. She didn't care about the dirt on her feet or the tears in her dress. She just ran, away from the cathedral, away from Charles Henderson, away from her father's plans for her life. She made it several blocks before she had to stop to catch her breath. That's when she heard the voices, wedding guests who had arrived, early walking toward the church. In a panic, she looked around for somewhere to hide. There was a fancy black Rolls-Royce parked nearby, and through some miracle, the back door was unlocked. Without thinking twice, she dove into the back seat and crouched down, trying to make herself as small as possible. The voices passed, and Valeria let out a sigh of relief. That's when she heard someone clear their throat. She slowly looked up and met the eyes of a man in the driver's seat, watching her through the rearview mirror. He had dark hair, sharp features, and the kind of eyes that seemed to see right through you. Interesting choice of hiding spot, he said, his voice deep and amused. Most people just use Uber these days. Valeria's face turned red. I'm so sorry. I'll get out right away. She reached for the door handle. Wait. His command stopped her in her tracks. You're clearly running from something. Or someone. He studied her through the mirror. Let me guess, wedding day jitters. Something like that, Valeria admitted, still ready to bolt. He was quiet for a moment, then started the car. Well, if you're going to hide in someone's car, you got lucky. I'm Damien Wolfe. Valeria's eyes widened. Everyone knew that name. Damien Wolfe was one of the most successful businessmen in New York, famous for building his company from nothing. He was also known for being ruthless in business deals. I'm Valeria Sinclair, she said, then immediately regretted giving her real name. Ah, Theodore Sinclair's daughter, the bride everyone's talking about. He pulled away from the curb. Your weddings all over the society pages. Though I have to say, this isn't quite how they predicted it would end. Please, Valeria said, her voice shaking. Please don't take me back there. Damien's eyes met hers in the mirror again. Something in his expression changed. I never do what people expect me to do. It's why I'm successful. He turned onto the main road, driving away from the cathedral. Besides, anyone brave enough to climb down a church in a wedding dress deserves at least a chance to explain herself. Valeria felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but for the first time that day they were tears of relief. She didn't know where Damien was taking her or what would happen next, but anything was better than going back to that church. They'll look for me, she said quietly. Let them look, Damien replied, a hint of steel in his voice. I'd like to see them try to get past my security. As they drove through the city, Valeria watched the cathedral disappear in the side mirror. She could imagine the chaos unfolding there. Her mother's hysterics, her father's rage, Charles's embarrassment. She should have felt guilty, but instead she felt something she hadn't felt in years, free. Where are we going? She finally asked. I have a penthouse in Manhattan, very private, very secure. You can stay there while you figure out your next move." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer a hotel." "No," Valeria said quickly. Hotels could be traced, credit cards could be tracked. Her father would find her within hours. "The penthouse sounds perfect." "Good." Damien's lips curved into a slight smile. "I have to admit, this is more interesting than the boring business meeting I was heading to." As they drove through the city, Valeria tried to process everything that had happened in the last hour. She had gone from being moments away from a loveless marriage to sitting in a billionaire's car, covered in dirt and torn lace, barefoot and probably looking like a complete mess. And somehow she didn't care about any of that. "You know," Damien said after a while, "most people would say I'm crazy for helping a runaway bride, especially the daughter of Theodore Sinclair. Your father isn't known for taking defeat well." "Are you afraid of him?" Valeria asked, genuinely curious. Damien actually laughed at that. "I've dealt with worse than Theodore Sinclair, much worse." His eyes met hers in the mirror again. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you've chosen freedom?" Valeria looked out the window at the city passing by. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been free before." The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a towering skyscraper. As they came to a stop, Damien turned to look at her properly, for the first time. "Well then," he said, "this should be interesting." Valeria Sinclair's heart was beating so fast, she thought it might burst right through her wedding dress. She stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite of St. Patrick's Cathedral, staring at her reflection. The dress cost more than most people's cars. Her father had made sure of that. Everything about this wedding was expensive and perfect, just like her whole life had been. But she felt like she was suffocating. "10 minutes until we start, dear," her mother said, poking her head through the door. "Your father is ready to walk you down the aisle." Valeria nodded, unable to speak. Her mother disappeared again, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The thought of marrying Charles Henderson, a 60-year-old business partner of her father's, made her stomach turn. She knew exactly why this marriage was happening, to merge the Sinclair and Henderson empires. She was just another business deal. She looked at the window. They were on the second floor, but there was a decorative ledge that ran around the building. If she was careful. Before she could talk herself out of it, Valeria opened the window. The spring air hit her face, and she took her first real breath in what felt like hours. Without thinking too much about it, she stepped onto the ledge, holding tight to the window frame. Her expensive wedding heels made it impossible to balance, so she kicked them off, watching them fall to the bushes below. "This is crazy," she whispered to herself, but kept moving. The ledge led to a drainpipe, and even in her giant wedding dress, she managed to climb down. Years of secret gymnastics lessons as a teenager finally came in handy. The moment her bare feet touched the ground, she ran. She didn't care about the dirt on her feet or the tears in her dress. She just ran, away from the cathedral, away from Charles Henderson, away from her father's plans for her life. She made it several blocks before she had to stop to catch her breath. That's when she heard the voices, wedding guests who had arrived, early, walking toward the church. In a panic, she looked around for somewhere to hide. There was a fancy black Rolls-Royce parked nearby, and through some miracle, the back door was unlocked. Without thinking twice, she dove into the back seat and crouched down, trying to make herself as small as possible. The voices passed, and Valeria let out a sigh of relief. That's when she heard someone clear their throat. She slowly looked up and met the eyes of a man in the driver's seat, watching her through the rearview mirror. He had dark hair, sharp features, and the kind of eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Interesting choice of hiding spot," he said, his voice deep and amused. "Most people just use Uber these days." Valeria's face turned red. "I'm so sorry. I'll get out right away." She reached for the door handle. "Wait." His command stopped her in her tracks. "You're clearly running from something. Or someone." He studied her through the mirror. "Let me guess. Wedding day jitters?" "Something like that," Valeria admitted, still ready to bolt. He was quiet for a moment, then started the car. "Well, if you're going to hide in someone's car, you got lucky. I'm Damien Wolfe." Valeria's eyes widened. Everyone knew that name. Damien Wolfe was one of the most successful businessmen in New York, famous for building his company from nothing. He was also known for being ruthless in business deals. "I'm Valeria Sinclair," she said, then immediately regretted giving her real name. "Ah, Theodore Sinclair's daughter. The bride everyone's talking about." He pulled away from the curb. "Your weddings all over the society pages, though I have to say this isn't quite how they predicted it would end." "Please," Valeria said, her voice shaking, "please don't take me back there." Damien's eyes met hers in the mirror again. Something in his expression changed. "I never do what people expect me to do. It's why I'm successful." He turned onto the main road, driving away from the cathedral. Besides, anyone brave enough to climb down a church in a wedding dress deserves at least a chance to explain herself. Valeria felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but for the first time that day, they were tears of relief. She didn't know where Damien was taking her, or what would happen next, but anything was better than going back to that church. "They'll look for me," she said quietly. "Let them look," Damien replied, a hint of steel in his voice. "I'd like to see them try to get past my security." As they drove through the city, Valeria watched the cathedral disappear in the side mirror. She could imagine the chaos unfolding there. Her mother's hysterics, her father's rage, Charles's embarrassment. She should have felt guilty, but instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Free. "Where are we going?" she finally asked. "I have a penthouse in Manhattan. Very private, very secure. You can stay there while you figure out your next move." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer a hotel." "No," Valeria said quickly. "Hotels could be traced. Credit cards could be tracked. Her father would find her within hours." "The penthouse sounds perfect." "Good." Damien's lips curved into a slight smile. "I have to admit, this is more interesting than the boring business meeting I was heading to." As they drove through the city, Valeria tried to process everything that had happened in the last hour. She had gone from being moments away from a loveless marriage to sitting in a billionaire's car, covered in dirt and torn lace, barefoot, and probably looking like a complete mess. And somehow she didn't care about any of that. "You know," Damien said after a while, "most people would say I'm crazy for helping a runaway bride, especially the daughter of Theodore Sinclair. Your father isn't known for taking defeat well. Are you afraid of him?" Valeria asked, genuinely curious. Damien actually laughed at that. "I've dealt with worse than Theodore Sinclair, much worse." His eyes met hers in the mirror again. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you've chosen freedom?" Valeria looked out the window at the city passing by. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been free before." The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a towering skyscraper. As they came to a stop, Damien turned to look at her properly for the first time. "Well then," he said, "this should be interesting." Damien's penthouse took up the entire top floor of the building. When they stepped out of the private elevator, Valeria couldn't help but gasp. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of New York City. But what caught her attention was how lived-in the place felt. She had expected something cold and modern, like the man himself, but there were books everywhere and comfortable-looking furniture. "The guest room is down that hallway," Damien said, pointing. "You'll find everything you need in there. I had my housekeeper stock it with basic necessities." "When did you have time to do that?" Valeria asked, confused. "I made a few calls while you were lost in thought during the drive." He shrugged like it was nothing. "I'm used to solving problems quickly." A woman appeared from what looked like the kitchen. She was older, with gray hair and kind eyes. "Oh good, you're here. I'm Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper. Come with me, dear. Let's get you out of that dress and into something comfortable." Valeria followed Mrs. Chen, grateful for the motherly presence. The older woman helped her out of the wedding dress, which was definitely ruined, and into some comfortable clothes that fit surprisingly well. "Mr. Wolf had me buy a few things in your size," Mrs. Chen explained. "He's very thorough." When Valeria emerged from the guest room wearing jeans and a sweater, she found Damien in his home office, typing away at his computer. He looked up when she entered. "Better?" he asked. "Much better. Thank you." She sat in one of the chairs across from his desk. "Why are you helping me?" Damien leaned back in his chair. "Let's just say, I understand what it's like to be trapped by other people's expectations. He studied her for a moment. "Your father called me, you know, while you were changing." Valeria's heart stopped. "What did he say?" "He offered me a very generous reward for returning you to the church." Damien's expression was unreadable. "Apparently, the wedding guests are still there, waiting to see if you'll come back." "And what did you tell him?" Valeria held her breath. "I told him I hadn't seen you." A small smile played at his lips. "I may be a ruthless businessman, but I'm not in the habit of forcing women to marry men they clearly don't want to marry." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Your father won't give up easily, neither will Charles Henderson. They're both used to getting what they want." "So am I going to be your prisoner instead?" Valeria asked, only half joking. Damien's eyes narrowed. "No, you're free to leave whenever you want. But I'm offering you protection while you figure out your next move. I have resources that can help you start a new life, if that's what you want." Before Valeria could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared with a tray of food. "You need to eat something," she said firmly. "Both of you, Mr. Wolf, you haven't eaten all day." As they ate the sandwiches Mrs. Chen had prepared, Valeria's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages. Finally, she turned it off. "Smart," Damien said. "They could trace it." "I feel like I'm in some kind of movie," Valeria admitted. "Running. Away from my wedding, hiding out in a billionaire's penthouse. Life is stranger than fiction sometimes." Damien stood up. "I have some work to do. Make yourself at home. Mrs. Chen will be here if you need anything." But as he walked past her chair, he paused. "And Valeria, whatever you decide to do next, remember, you're not alone anymore." Those words hit her hard. All her life she had felt alone, even surrounded by people. Her mother was more interested in social status than in being a mother. Her father saw her as a business asset. Her friends were all chosen for her based on their family connections. She spent the rest of the day exploring the penthouse, finding comfort in the library full of books. Mrs. Chen brought her tea and cookies, telling her stories about her own life that made Valeria laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. As night fell over the city, Valeria stood at the windows, watching the lights come on across New York. She heard Damien come up behind her. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked. "I was just thinking about how different everything looks from up here," she said. "All my life, I've been told exactly what to do, who to be, how to act, and now you get to decide for yourself." He stood beside her, their reflections side by side in the glass. "It's terrifying, isn't it? Freedom." "Yes," she whispered, "but exciting too." "Your father won't stop looking for you," Damien said quietly. "He's already hired private investigators. He's convinced I know where you are." "Does that worry you?" "No," his voice was firm. "I've dealt with worse than Theodore Sinclair, but you should be prepared. This won't be easy." Valeria turned to look at him. "Why do I get the feeling you know exactly what I'm going through?" Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or memory. "Because I do. I wasn't born into wealth like you were. I fought my way up from nothing, and along the way I learned that the hardest prison to escape is the one other people build around you with their expectations. How did you do it? Break free?" "One day at a time." He smiled slightly. "And I had help even though I didn't want to admit I needed it." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city below. Finally, Damien spoke again. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "Stay here. Let me help you. Not as a prisoner, but as, let's call it a temporary arrangement. I can teach you how to be truly independent, how to handle your own money, make your own decisions, and in return..." "In return what?" Valeria asked when he paused. "In return, you help me understand something I've never quite figured out. How to actually enjoy life instead of just conquering it." Valeria laughed softly. "That sounds like a fair trade. Do we have a deal then?" He held out his hand. She took it, feeling the warmth of his grip. Deal. Neither of them knew it then, but that handshake would change both their lives forever. As they stood there, the city sparkling below them, the world they knew was already shifting, rearranging itself into something new and unexpected. And somewhere across town, In a church full of angry wedding guests, Theodore Sinclair was making calls, pulling strings, determined to find his daughter and bring her back. But he didn't know what Valeria was just beginning to learn, that sometimes the best things in life happen when you dare to break free from the path others have chosen for you. Charles Henderson was not a man used to being humiliated. He sat in his office, looking at the newspaper headlines about the failed wedding. His wrinkled hands crumpled the paper in anger. His phone rang. It was Theodore Sinclair. "Any news?" Charles asked sharply. "My investigators think she's somewhere in Manhattan," Theodore replied. "And I'm convinced Damian Wolfe knows something." He turned down a $5 million reward without blinking. "Wolfe?" Charles's eyes narrowed. "That upstart who's been buying up tech companies." "The same. He was supposed to be at a business meeting near the church that morning. And now he's suddenly unreachable." Charles stood up and walked to his window. "Find her, Theodore, whatever it costs. That merger cannot fall apart." Meanwhile, in Damian's penthouse, Valeria was starting her first day of what he called freedom training. She sat across from him at his dining room table, looking at stacks of papers. "First lesson," Damian said, "understanding money. Real money, not the trust fund kind." "I know about money," Valeria protested. "No, you know about spending it. There's a difference." He pushed some documents toward her. "These are basic investment portfolios. By the time we're done, you'll know how to make your own money grow." Mrs. Chen brought them coffee and watched with amusement as Damian explained stocks, bonds, and mutual funds to Valeria. Despite her initial resistance, she was a quick learner. "So you're not as helpless as they made you believe," Damian observed during a break. "They never gave me a chance to be anything else," Valeria replied softly. Their lesson was interrupted by Damian's security chief, Marcus, rushing in. "Sir, we have a problem. Private investigators are asking questions at all the high-end buildings in the area. They're showing her picture around." Damian remained calm. "Expected. Double the security. No one gets in without my direct approval." Valeria felt panic rising. "Maybe I should leave. I don't want to cause you trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Damian said firmly. "They're causing trouble. There's a difference." Later that afternoon, Valeria was in the library when she heard raised voices from Damian's office. She crept closer to listen. "Mr. Sinclair, as I told you before, I haven't seen your daughter." Damian's voice was cold. "And these threats you're making? Not very smart." "Listen here, Wolfe." Theodore's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "I built this city's business world while you were still playing with toys. If you're hiding Valeria, if I was hiding her, you'd never find her," Damian cut in. "And let me be very clear. Your influence in this city isn't what it used to be. Times change. Old men who force their daughters into arranged marriages, they don't do well in today's news cycle." The line went dead. Valeria stood frozen until she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mrs. Chen. "Come help me make dinner," the older woman said kindly. "It's better than listening at doors." In the kitchen, as they chopped vegetables together, Mrs. Chen told stories about when she first started working for Damian. "He was so serious back then," she said. "Always working, never smiling. But he has a good heart. He just doesn't show it often." "Why did he really help me?" Valeria asked. Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. "Maybe he saw something of himself in you. Or maybe," she paused, "maybe he needed saving as much as you did." That evening, Damian found Valeria on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket against the spring chill. "I heard what you said to my father," she said without turning around. "Eavesdropping becomes a habit with you," he noted, amusement in his voice. "Thank you for standing up to him. Someone should have done it long ago." He joined her at the railing. "Your father and Charles Henderson, they're dinosaurs. They think they can still control everything and everyone through money and threats. They don't understand that the world has changed." "Have you ever been afraid of anything?" Valeria asked suddenly. Damian was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, once. I was afraid of becoming like my father." "What happened to him?" "He drank himself to death in a cheap apartment after gambling away every penny we had. Left me and my mother with nothing but debts." His voice was distant. "That's why I started my company. To prove I could be different." Valeria reached out and touched his hand. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. "You are different," she said softly. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. But before either could speak, Marcus appeared. "Sir, we have a situation. Someone leaked to the press that Miss Sinclair might be in the building. There are reporters gathering outside." Damien's expression hardened. "Get the car ready, the private entrance." "We're leaving?" Valeria asked. "I have a house in the Hamptons, much more private. We'll go there until this dies down." He turned to her. "Unless you'd rather stay and face them." "No," she said quickly. I trust you." Those 3 words seemed to affect him more than he wanted to show. He turned away quickly, but not before she saw something flash in his eyes. Within an hour, they were in his car, driving through the darkness toward the coast. Mrs. Chen had packed bags for both of them, and Marcus followed in another car. "I'm sorry for disrupting your life like this," Valeria said as they drove. "My life needed disrupting," Damien replied, his eyes on the road. "It was getting boring anyway." She laughed, and he smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face. Neither of them noticed the black SUV that pulled out to follow them, or the man inside reporting their location to Charles Henderson. The game was about to change, but for now, in the quiet of the car, with the city lights fading behind them, they had a moment of peace, a moment where a runaway bride and a lonely billionaire could just be 2 people, driving through the night, toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The Hampton house wasn't really a house at all. It was an estate. Damien's car pulled up to wrought iron gates that opened silently at their approach. The driveway wound through manicured gardens until a massive beach house came into view, its windows glowing warmly in the night. "This is your idea of a hideout?" Valeria asked, amazed. "Sometimes hiding in plain sight is the best strategy," Damien replied as they pulled up to the front door. "The neighbors here are too wealthy to care about gossip. Privacy is everyone's top priority." Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with large windows facing the ocean. Like his penthouse, it was filled with books and comfortable furniture. The sound of waves could be heard in every room. "Your suite is upstairs, first door on the right," Damien said. Mrs. Chen already had everything set up. "Does that woman ever sleep?" Valeria wondered aloud. "I sometimes think she's actually magical," Damien admitted with a small smile. As if summoned, Mrs. Chen appeared with hot tea and sandwiches. "You both need to eat something before bed. It's been a long day." They sat in the kitchen eating quietly, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, Damien spoke. "We were followed." Valeria's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "What?" "Don't worry, Marcus. Lost them before we got here, but they're getting bolder." He looked troubled. "Your father must be desperate." "The merger," Valeria said quietly. "If I don't marry Charles, father loses his chance to merge with Henderson Industries. It would be worth billions. And that's worth more to him than his daughter's happiness?" Damien's voice had an edge to it. "It always has been." The next morning, Valeria woke to sunlight streaming through her windows and the sound of waves. For a moment, she forgot everything. The wedding, the escape, the chase. Then it all came rushing back. She found Damien in his home office, already working. He looked up when she entered. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted. "What's the plan for today?" "More lessons." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Today we're learning about corporate strategy. Knowing how your father and Henderson think might help us stay ahead of them." They spent the morning going over business documents, Damien teaching her how to read between the lines, how to spot hidden meanings in corporate language. She was surprised to find it fascinating. "You're good at this," he said, after she correctly identified a hidden clause in a contract. "How you have natural instincts for business. Father never thought so. He said women should stay out of the boardroom." "Your father is an idiot," Damien said bluntly. "You could run circles around half the CEOs I know. They broke for lunch on the terrace." The ocean stretched endlessly before them, and a warm breeze carried the salt smell of the sea. "Tell me something real about yourself," Valeria said suddenly. "Something nobody else knows." Damien was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I'm lonely. Even in a room full of people, I'm always lonely." The admission hung in the air between them. "Me too," Valeria whispered. Their eyes met. and that electric something passed between them again. This time, there was no interruption, no Marcus with urgent news. Just two lonely people, seeing each other clearly for perhaps the first time. Damien reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm, gentle but firm. Neither of them spoke, afraid to break whatever spell had fallen over them. The moment was shattered by the sound of helicopter blades. Marcus burst onto the terrace. "Sir, media helicopter incoming. They must have tracked us somehow." Damien was on his feet instantly, pulling Valeria up. "Inside, now." They rushed into the house as the helicopter appeared over the trees, its camera clearly visible. "How did they find us?" Valeria asked, her heart pounding. "Someone talked," Damien said grimly. "Someone always talks when enough money is offered." He turned to Marcus. "Get the boat ready." "Boat?" Valeria asked. "I keep a yacht docked nearby. We can use it to get back to the city without being followed." He looked at her. "Unless you'd rather stay and face them?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm tired of running, but I'm not ready to face them yet." "Good." He squeezed her hand. "Because I'm not ready to let you go yet." The words surprised them both. Damien looked away quickly, but not before Valeria saw the vulnerability in his eyes. They made their way down to the private dock behind the house, while Marcus dealt with the media helicopter. The yacht was beautiful, all sleek lines and luxury. As they pulled away from the dock, Valeria watched the helicopter hovering over the house. From the boat, it looked small and harmless. "You know," she said, "a month ago, my biggest worry was whether the flowers at my wedding would match the bridesmaids' dresses perfectly." Damien laughed. "And now I'm running from the paparazzi on a billionaire's yacht." She shook her head. "Life is strange. In my experience, the best things in life are the unexpected ones." He stood close to her at the rail, their shoulders touching. "The ones you never planned for." As they sailed away from the Hamptons, leaving the helicopter and the reporters and all the chaos behind, Valeria felt something she hadn't expected. Happiness. Pure, simple happiness. But back at the house, a figure watched the yacht disappear into the distance. He pulled out a phone and dialed. "Mr. Henderson. They're on the move again. But don't worry, I planted the tracker like you asked. We know exactly where they're going." The game wasn't over. It was just moving to a new playing field. The yacht cut smoothly through the dark waters of the Atlantic. Night had fallen, and the lights of the Hamptons had disappeared behind them. Valeria stood at the bow, letting the wind whip through her hair. Damien approached with 2 mugs of hot coffee. "You should get some rest," he said, handing her a mug. "It's been a long day." "I'm too wired to sleep." She took a sip of coffee. "Where exactly are we going?" "I have a private marina in a quiet part of Brooklyn. We can dock there and figure out our next move." A sudden wave rocked the boat, making Valeria stumble. Damien caught her, his arms strong and steady around her waist. They stayed like that for a moment too long, their faces close, hearts beating fast. Then Marcus's voice came over the intercom. "Sir, we have company. 2 speedboats, approaching from the east." Damien released Valeria and rushed to the bridge. Through the night vision equipment, they could see 2 dark boats moving fast toward them. "Henderson's men," Damien growled. "They must have followed us somehow." "How?" Valeria asked, her voice shaking. Marcus was checking the yacht with some kind of electronic device. He stopped near the stern, the device beeping rapidly. "Found it, tracking device. They must have planted it at the house." Damien's face darkened with anger. "Can you remove it?" "Already done, sir, but they've already found us." The speedboats were getting closer. Damien took the yacht's controls himself, increasing speed. "Hold on," he warned Valeria. "This might get rough." The yacht surged forward, but the smaller boats were faster. They could hear the roar of their engines getting closer. "Why don't we just stop?" Valeria asked. "Let them catch us. I can't keep running forever." "Because they're not here to negotiate," Damien said grimly. "Look." Through the night vision screen, they could see men on the boats raising what looked like weapons. "They wouldn't dare," Valeria whispered. "Charles Henderson didn't get rich by playing nice," Damien replied. "Marcus, get the Coast Guard on the line, now." Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and something hit the side of the yacht. Valeria screamed. "They're shooting at us," she gasped. Warning shots, Damien said through gritted teeth. They want us to stop. He turned to Marcus. Get her below deck. I'm not leaving you, Valeria protested. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Damien grabbed her shoulders. Valeria, please. I can't focus on outrunning them if I'm worried about you getting hurt. The look in his eyes made her heart skip. She nodded and let Marcus lead her to the cabin below. Above, she could hear Damien radioing for help. The Coast Guard was too far away to reach them quickly. They were on their own. The yacht pitched and rolled as Damien executed evasive maneuvers. In the cabin, Valeria held onto the bed, praying. She had never been so scared, not even on her wedding day. Suddenly, the boat made a sharp turn. There was a crash, followed by shouts. Valeria ran up to the deck despite Marcus trying to stop her. Damien had managed to turn the yacht so sharply that one of the pursuing boats had to swerve to avoid collision. In doing so, it had crashed into the other boat. Both vessels were now dead in the water. Coast Guard's on their way, Damien announced. They'll find our friends out there soon enough. Valeria threw herself into his arms. He held her tight, his heart pounding against her cheek. I was so scared, she whispered. Me too, he admitted softly. When I saw those guns, I realized something. She looked up at him. What? I realized I'm not just protecting you because it's the right thing to do anymore. His voice was rough with emotion. I'm protecting you because the thought of anything happening to you terrifies me. Before she could respond, Marcus interrupted. Sir, you need to see this. He handed Damien his tablet. On the screen was a news article that had just been published. Henderson Industries announces hostile takeover bid for Wolf Enterprises. They're coming after my company, Damien said in disbelief. This was Father's plan all along, Valeria realized. He and Charles, they're not just trying to get me back. They're trying to destroy you for helping me. Damien's face was hard as stone. They can try. He looked at her. But now we fight back. We? She asked. He took her hand. Yes, we. I'm in this with you now, all the way. If they want a war, they'll get one. As the yacht continued toward Brooklyn, Valeria knew everything had changed. This wasn't just about her running from an unwanted marriage anymore. This was about two people against the world, fighting not just for freedom, but for each other. In the distance, they could hear police sirens approaching the stranded boats. But Valeria wasn't scared anymore. Standing next to Damien, feeling the strength of his hand in hers, she felt something else entirely. She felt ready to fight back. Back in New York, Damien's private marina was a flurry of activity. Police boats surrounded them as statements were taken about the attack. The news of Henderson's takeover attempt was spreading fast, and Damien's phone wouldn't stop ringing. My board wants an emergency meeting, he told Valeria as they finally made it to his car. Henderson's offering 20% above market value for shares. He's using his own money to try to take your company? Valeria asked. No, Damien said, grimly. He's using your father's money, the money that would have been part of your dowry. They drove to a different building this time, a luxury hotel where Damien kept a suite for emergencies. As soon as they arrived, he called his legal team. I don't care what time it is, he barked into the phone. Get everyone here now. Within an hour, the suite was filled with lawyers and financial advisors. Valeria sat quietly in a corner, watching Damien work. He was different here, harder, more focused. This was the ruthless businessman everyone talked about. They're playing dirty, one lawyer said, using the media coverage of the runaway bride story to shake investor confidence. Our stock is already down 12%. Then we play dirtier, Damien replied. He turned to Valeria. I need your help. Me? What can I do? You know things about your father's business, things that could help us fight back. Valeria thought about all the dinner conversations she'd overheard, all the documents she'd seen on her father's desk over the years. Yes, she said slowly. I do. For the next several hours, she told them everything. About her father's secret deals in Asia, about Charles Henderson's habit of buying politicians, about the offshore accounts where they hid money from taxes. This is exactly what we need, Damien's lead lawyer said excitedly. With this information, we can request a federal investigation. Do it, Damien ordered. Then he looked at Valeria. Are you sure about this? They're your family. They stopped, being my family the moment they tried to sell me into marriage, she said firmly. Do what you have to do. Damien squeezed her hand under the table. One by one, the lawyers left to start working on their counterattack. Soon, only Damien and Valeria remained. I never wanted to drag you into a corporate war, he said softly. You didn't drag me anywhere, I chose to be here. She moved closer to him on the couch. Besides, I kind of like seeing this side of you, the warrior. He laughed, but his eyes were intense as they met hers. You make me want to be more than just a warrior. Their faces drew closer, the air between them electric. This time there were no interruptions, no emergencies. When their lips met, it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, years of loneliness and longing pouring out. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. I've wanted to do that since you climbed into my car in that wedding dress, Damien admitted. Even with mascara running down my face and dirt on my feet? Especially then, you looked so brave, so free. Their moment was interrupted by Damien's phone. It was, Marcus. Sir, you need to see the news now. They turned on the TV. Theodore Sinclair was holding a press conference outside his office building. My daughter has been kidnapped by Damien Wolfe, he was saying, his face a mask of fatherly concern. He's holding her against her will, using her to attack our companies. We've filed criminal charges and the police are on their way to arrest him now. That lying bastard, Valeria seethed. Damien was already moving. We need to get out of here. They'll check the hotels first. Where can we go? He smiled. I have one more safe house, somewhere they'll never think to look. They took the service elevator down to the garage, where Marcus was waiting with the car. As they drove through the city, Valeria noticed they were heading to a very different neighborhood. Brooklyn, but not the wealthy part. They pulled up to an old brownstone on a quiet street. Inside it was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and family photos on the walls. Where are we? Valeria asked. My mother's house, Damien said softly. Where I grew up. An older woman appeared from the kitchen, her face kind but worried. I saw the news, she said, hugging Damien. Are you both all right? We're fine, Mum. This is Valeria. The runaway bride, Damien's mother said with a knowing smile. Welcome to our home, dear. They'll never find you here. As they settled in, for the night, Valeria looked around the modest bedroom Damien had grown up in. There were old science trophies on the shelves, faded posters on the walls. This is where it all started, Damien said, following her gaze. Where I first dreamed of building something of my own. It's perfect, Valeria said, and meant it. Here, in this simple house with its warm kitchen and family photos, she felt safer than she ever had in her father's mansion. Damien pulled her close. Tomorrow we fight back. The lawyers will file their complaints. The investigations will begin. But tonight we rest, she finished, kissing him softly. Outside, the city hummed with activity. Somewhere her father and Charles Henderson were plotting their next move. But here, in this sanctuary of childhood memories and new beginnings, none of that mattered. For the first time in her life, Valeria was exactly where she wanted to be. Morning came with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. In the small kitchen of the Brooklyn brownstone, Damien's mother, Rose, was teaching Valeria how to make pancakes. My son never had time for breakfast, Rose said, showing Valeria how to flip a pancake perfectly, always rushing off to build his empire. Mom? Damien protested from the doorway. I wasn't that bad. You missed Sunday dinner for 3 years straight, Rose reminded him. She turned to Valeria. But he always made sure I had everything I needed. Tried to buy me a bigger house too, but I told him no, this is home. Valeria understood. This house had more warmth than any mansion she'd ever lived in. The TV in the living room was playing the morning news. Theodore Sinclair was giving another interview, playing the part of the concerned father perfectly. My only daughter, he said, his voice breaking for the cameras. If you're watching this, Valeria, please come home. Whatever Wolfe has told you, whatever he's promised you, he's just using you to attack our companies. Valeria's hands shook as she poured more batter into the pan. Rose turned off the TV with a firm click. That man, she said, is no father. A real father puts his child's Happiness first. Damien's phone rang. It was his legal team. The federal investigation is moving forward, he told them after hanging up. They're particularly interested in those offshore accounts you told us about. Good, Valeria said. It's time they faced consequences. They ate breakfast together, like a real family. Rose told stories about Damien's childhood, making Valeria laugh and Damien blush. He was always protecting people, Rose said, even as a boy. The neighborhood kids called him their guardian angel. Mom, please, Damien groaned. But Valeria saw the pride in his eyes. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by Marcus rushing. Tin? Sir, we have a problem. Someone leaked your mother's address to the press. They're on their way. Through the window, they could already see news vans appearing at the end of the street. We need to go, Damien said, but Rose stopped him. No, she said firmly. No more running. This is our home, and it's time to show them what this family is made of. What do you mean? Valeria asked. I mean, dear, that you're going to give them what they want, an interview, but you're going to tell them the truth. Damien looked worried. Mom, it's too dangerous. The most dangerous thing, Rose said wisely, is letting others control your story. Valeria stood up. She's right. I'm tired of my father speaking for me. It's time I spoke for myself. Within minutes, reporters had surrounded the house, but instead of running, Valeria walked out onto the front steps, Damien and Rose beside her. Cameras flashed as she began to speak. My name is Valeria Sinclair, and I want to tell you the truth. I wasn't kidnapped. I ran away from a forced marriage to a man 3 times my age. Damien Wolfe didn't steal me, he saved me, and now my father and Charles Henderson are trying to destroy him for it. She told them everything, about the arranged marriage, about the offshore accounts, about the attack on the yacht. The real story here isn't about a runaway bride, she finished. It's about powerful men who think they can buy and sell people's lives. Well, not anymore. The reporters erupted with questions, but Valeria had said what she needed to say. She turned and walked back into the house, head held high. Inside, Damien pulled her close. That was incredibly brave. I learned from the best, she said, smiling at him and Rose. His phone buzzed, a message from his lawyers. The story was already going viral. Sinclair Industries' stock was plummeting. The FBI had just arrived at Charles Henderson's office with a search warrant. It's starting, Damien said. The empire they built on lies is crumbling. Rose brought them tea, unfazed by the media circus outside her door. Now that's settled, she said. When are you two getting married? Mom, Damien choked on his tea, but as their eyes met over their teacups, something passed between them. A future, maybe. A promise. Outside, the world was changing. Inside, in this small Brooklyn kitchen, love was blooming. Real love, not the kind that could be bought or sold. And in their offices across town, Theodore Sinclair and Charles Henderson were about to learn a hard lesson. Sometimes the people you try to control turn out to be stronger than you ever imagined. The fallout was immediate. By evening, every major news channel was running Valeria's story. Cell phone videos of her speech on the brownstone steps went viral. The hashtag #JamStandWithValeria was trending worldwide. In Charles Henderson's office, things were falling apart. FBI agents were going through every file, every computer. His secretary of 30 years was already cooperating with authorities, telling them about the bribes, the secret accounts, the deals made in back rooms. Theodore Sinclair wasn't faring any better. Reporters had dug up other families who claimed he had tried to arrange marriages for their daughters in exchange for business deals. His wife had fled to their house in Switzerland, refusing to answer his calls. What do you mean you can't stop them? Theodore shouted into his phone. His lawyer was trying to explain that the federal investigation couldn't be blocked this time. Too many eyes were watching. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Valeria was getting a very different kind of education. Rose was teaching her how to make her grandmother's lasagna recipe. The secret, Rose said, is in how much love you put into it. Damien watched them from the doorway, his heart full. He'd never seen Valeria so relaxed, so happy. Her designer clothes were replaced by jeans and one of his old college sweatshirts. Her perfect manicure was slightly smudged with tomato sauce. His phone buzzed. Another message from his legal team. The SEC was now involved, investigating both Sinclair and Henderson for securities fraud. "You know what the best revenge is?" Rose asked, noticing the message. "Living well. Now come help with this garlic bread." That evening, as they sat around Rose's small dining table, eating lasagna and drinking wine from mismatched glasses, Valeria felt tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Damien asked softly. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "That's just it. This is what family is supposed to feel like." Rose reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're family now, dear, whether you marry my stubborn son or not." "Mom," Damien protested, but he was smiling. Their dinner was interrupted by an urgent knock. Marcus entered, looking grave. "Your mother," he said to Valeria. "She's here." Eleanor Sinclair stood in the living room, looking out of place in her designer suit and pearls. When she saw Valeria, she burst into tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I should have protected you. I should have stood up to your father years ago." Valeria hesitated, then hugged her mother. Years of distance and disappointment melted away. "In that embrace, your father," Eleanor said, pulling back. "He's done terrible things. I've been gathering evidence for years, keeping copies of documents, recording conversations. I was too afraid to use it before, but now..." She opened her briefcase and pulled out files, USB drives, recordings. "Take it," she said. "Use it. Stop him before he hurts anyone else." Damien's lawyers worked through the night, going through Eleanor's evidence. It was the final nail in the coffin for Theodore Sinclair and Charles Henderson's empires. By morning, arrest warrants were being prepared. But Theodore had one last card to play. He appeared on the morning news looking broken and desperate. "Valeria," he pleaded, "if you come home now, if you marry Charles as planned, we can fix this. The charges can go away. The company can be saved. Think of all the employees who will lose their jobs." Valeria watched the broadcast from Rose's kitchen, where the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Damien stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. "He's still trying to control you," he said softly. "I know," she replied, "but he doesn't understand. I'm not that person anymore." She turned to face him. "The company can be restructured. The employees can be protected. But I will never again let someone else decide my life for me." Damien kissed her then, in his mother's kitchen, with the morning sun streaming through the windows and the taste of coffee on their lips. Rose pretended to be very busy with her bread dough, but she was smiling. Outside, reporters were still camped on the street. The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But inside that Brooklyn brownstone, everything that mattered had already been decided. Love had won. Not the kind that could be arranged or bought, but the real kind. The kind that grows in small kitchens and quiet moments, in brave choices and gentle hands, the kind that changes everything. The arrest happened at dawn. FBI agents surrounded Theodore Sinclair's mansion while he was still having his morning coffee. Charles Henderson was picked up at his private airport, trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. Valeria watched the news coverage from Rose's living room, Damien's arm around her shoulders. Federal agents have arrested prominent businessmen, Theodore Sinclair and Charles Henderson, on multiple charges, including fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy, the reporter announced. Sources say the evidence came from within their own families. Eleanor Sinclair had gone into protective custody after turning over the evidence. She called Valeria that morning. "I've filed for divorce," she said. "I should have done it years." "Hagos, are you okay?" Valeria asked. "I'm better than okay. I'm free." Eleanor paused. "Just like you." The story dominated the news for weeks. More victims of Theodore and Charles's schemes came forward. Former employees testified about years of corruption and illegal dealings. Damien's company not only survived the attempted takeover, but grew stronger. The business world respected how he had protected Valeria and helped expose corruption. "Your father and Henderson will probably make deals with prosecutors," Damien's lawyer said during a meeting. "But they're still looking at serious prison time, and their empires are finished." Life settled into a new rhythm. Valeria started taking business classes at NYU, determined to understand the world her father had tried to keep her from. Every morning, she and Damien had breakfast with Rose before heading into the city. "You know," Rose said one morning, "this house hasn't been so full of life since Damien was a boy. They were still living in the Brooklyn brownstone. Damien had suggested moving back to his penthouse, but Valeria loved it here. This house had become her first real home. One evening, as they walked through the neighborhood after dinner, Damien seemed nervous. "Remember when you climbed into my car that day?" he asked suddenly. "How could I forget? I was so scared. I almost drove you straight back to the church," he admitted. "It would have been the sensible thing to do. Why didn't you?" He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because when I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw something in your eyes. Not just fear, but courage. The determination to change your life, no matter the cost." He took a small box from his pocket. "You changed my life too." Valeria's heart stopped as he got down on one knee right there on the sidewalk. "I'm not asking because of our families or business or what anyone else thinks," he said. "I'm asking because I love you. Because you make me want to be better. Because this world makes sense when you're in it." He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond ring. "Valeria Sinclair, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." They kissed right there on the street, not caring who saw. When they got back to the house, Rose was waiting up. "Finally," she said, hugging them both. "I was wondering when he'd get up the courage." "You knew?" Valeria asked. "Of course I knew. He asked for his grandmother's ring last week." Rose's eyes twinkled. "I've never seen him so nervous." That night, lying in bed, Valeria looked at the ring sparkling on her finger. "What are you thinking?" Damien asked. "I'm thinking about that morning in the church, when I was so afraid of being trapped in a loveless marriage. I never imagined running away would lead me to real love." He pulled her close. "Sometimes the best things in life happen when we're brave enough to run away from the wrong things." Outside their window, the Brooklyn street was quiet. The reporters were long gone, the scandal fading from the headlines. Theodore Sinclair and Charles Henderson's empires had crumbled, but something much stronger had been built from their ruins. Real family, a true love, a life chosen, not arranged. And it all started with a runaway bride who dared to climb into a stranger's car, and a man who dared to drive her toward freedom instead of back to her cage.